before we talk about pyramids, before we talk about peasants or ovens or church tithes, let's talk about something simple. Bread. Not the fancy kind with 7 grains and seeds on top, just good, honest bread. The kind your grandmother might have made. The kind you tear with your hands, not slice with a machine. It's easy to forget how important bread used to be. But once upon a time, bread wasn't just food. It was survival. For most of human history, bread was the meal, not a side dish, not a warm-up, not something you dipped in soup. It was the meal. If you had bread, you lived. If you didn't, well, you prayed you'd last until the next harvest. And bread wasn't just food. It was power. It was labor. It was status. What kind of bread you ate said a lot about who you were. Dark rye meant you were poor. Fine white wheat, that meant wealth, or at least privilege. Even the texture mattered. If your bread had pebbles in it, chances are you weren't eating at the Lord's table. So, how did it all begin? How did this simple mix of flour and water become one of the most powerful forces in human civilization? Why did kings build bakeries next to palaces? And why did peasants risk death just to steal a little flour? Why did ancient priests offer bread to the gods, while medieval rulers taxed it like gold? This story goes back, way back, not just to the Middle Ages, not even to ancient Egypt, but even before that, before writing, before cities, before history was even history. Humans were making bread. It wasn't soft, it wasn't fluffy, and it probably had more sand in it than salt, but it was bread nonetheless. When early humans figured out how to grind grain, everything changed. Grain could be stored, it could be cooked, it could be traded. That changed how people lived, and it changed where they lived. You didn't have to chase your food anymore. Now, your food could wait for you. Bread let people build villages, and eventually, cities. It turned nomads into farmers, hunters into millers, and wanderers into workers, all because of grain and the fire to bake it. And here's the thing, bread is everywhere. Every culture has its version. Flatbread in Mesopotamia, pita in Greece, tortillas in Mesoamerica, chapati in India, steam buns in China, rye loaves in Northern Europe, whether it was baked on hot stones, or steamed in clay ovens, or buried under coals. Bread followed humanity like a shadow. But in this story, we're going to focus on one path. The road that runs from the sands of ancient Egypt to the smoky hearths of medieval Europe. A journey of 10,000 years, told through flour, fire, and the fight to eat. Along the way, we'll meet the bakers of Thebes, the bread priests of Greece, the Roman bread factories that fed an empire. We'll see how medieval laws told people what bread they could eat, when they could eat it, and how much it had to weigh. We'll visit poor peasants gnawing on coarse rye crusts, and nobles who dined with golden loaves shaped like animals. We'll smell the ovens. We'll hear the coins drop on the baker's table. We'll feel the hunger that drove people to riot over a missing roll. And in the end, we'll understand why bread was never just bread. So, pour yourself a cup of something warm. Settle in, because this is the story of the most important food you've probably never thought much about. The story of bread, where it came from, why it mattered, and how it shaped the world you live in. Ready? Let's start where history began, with a little flour, a little water, and a spark. So, long before pyramids rose above the Nile, long before Julius Caesar ever sliced a loaf, bread was already here. It didn't come with kings. It came with the soil, with grain, with human hands grinding seeds and shaping something soft from something hard. The very first breads weren't really breads as we think of them today. They were more like patties, flat, rough, heavy, maybe even bitter, made from wild grains, emmer, einkorn, or barley, crushed by stone, mixed with water, and left to cook on hot rocks beneath the sun. No yeast, no salt, no shaping, just a mixture of flour and hope. Archaeologists have found 14,000-year-old evidence of this kind of bread at a place called Shubaika in what's now Jordan. That's 4,000 years before agriculture even became a thing. In other words, people were baking bread before they were farming grain. How? Simple. They foraged. They gathered seeds from wild grasses, spent hours grinding them between rocks, and when they had enough, they made something that stuck together and fed their bellies. And that's how the journey began. Eventually, folks figured something out. If you scatter some of those grains nearby and wait a while, you don't have to walk so far to find them next time. That idea changed everything, because now, instead of chasing herds, you could stay in one place, grow your food, store your food, share your food, and bake it. That led to settlements, little huts, built near little fields, tucked near little rivers, and in the center of those villages, fire, stone, and bread, always bread. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't soft or sweet, but it was filling, and in a world where hunger came knocking often, that was all that mattered. Now, here's something funny. Even back then, bread was already work. To make enough grain for a single loaf, a person might need to grind by hand for an hour or more. Imagine that. No machines, no mixers, just a flat rock, a rounded stone, and a tired arm. But they did it, day after day, season after season, because they had to, because it worked. As these early villages grew, so did the techniques. People began to experiment, adding seeds, trying different grains, leaving dough out a little longer. And one day, maybe by accident, someone left the wet grain mixture sitting too long, and it bubbled, it puffed, it changed. Fermentation had begun, and when they baked it, it rose, just a little, but enough. The world's first leavened bread had arrived. No one knew it yet, but that little accident would change food forever. Over time, these early bread makers began using fire pits, clay domes, and eventually ovens. Some made bread shaped like discs, others shaped theirs like balls, sticks, or even animals. Each group, each tribe, each early people left their own mark on this food. And yet, through all of it, bread stayed humble. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't a delicacy. It was the food you could count on when the hunt failed, when the rains didn't come, when the winter dragged on too long. So, next time you pass by a loaf on a shelf, think about the hands that shaped its ancient cousin. Hands that lived in huts, that woke up before sunrise, that ground stone into flour and turned it into survival, all before the first king ever put on a crown. Because before there was wealth, before there was war, before there was even history, there was bread. And in the next part of our story, that bread will rise again, under the hot sun, in a land called Egypt, where flour met science and bread met civilization. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of gold, land of gods, and land of bread. More than the pyramids, more than the pharaohs. If there was one thing Egypt did better than anyone else in its day, it was baking. In fact, if you could time travel back 4,000 years and walk through a street in Thebes or Memphis, you'd smell bread everywhere, smoke rising from clay ovens, flour dust in the air, children chewing on crusts, and bakers shouting over the noise of donkeys and carts. Fresh loaves, just baked. You see, Egypt was one of the first places in history to truly master the science of baking. They didn't just make bread, they engineered it. They developed grinding stones, invented special mixing troughs, built mud brick ovens with air vents and fire chambers. They even had baking molds, shaped clay containers to make uniform loaves. Standardized, repeatable, efficient. This was industrial baking, before industry even existed. And they weren't just making one kind of bread. Oh no. Some breads were flat, some were puffy, some were sweetened with dates or honey. Others were studded with nuts or herbs. There were bread cones, bread rings, bread animals, and bread bricks. One ancient Egyptian tomb painting shows over 40 different bread shapes, all baked, arranged, and offered to the gods. Because yes, bread in Egypt wasn't just food, it was spiritual. Temples had their own bakeries. Priests supervised the baking of sacred loaves. Every morning, offerings were placed at the feet of statues. Fresh water, fresh beer, and always fresh bread. It was how you fed the gods. And maybe, just maybe, how you kept the Nile flowing. But let's not forget the people. Ordinary Egyptians, farmers, laborers, builders, they ate bread every day. In fact, most workers were paid in bread. You haul stone blocks for a pyramid? Here's your ration. A jug of beer, a loaf of bread. That's your wage. And honestly, that bread was life. But it wasn't perfect. Egyptian bread was often coarse, made from emmer wheat, a grain full of husks and hard to mill. So they used stone grinders, which meant tiny bits of grit and sand ended up in the flour, which meant Egyptian bread could wear down your teeth. Archaeologists have found skulls from the time with teeth ground flat, smooth as river stones. Bread gave life, but it also gave you a sore jaw. Still, it was better than starving. And Egyptians were clever. They fermented their dough, using natural yeast from the air. They learned how long to leave it, how warm to keep it, when to punch it down and shape it. They knew the feel of dough. They were bakers in the oldest, truest sense. And you know what? They wrote about it. Some of the oldest surviving texts we have aren't about kings or battles. They're about grain, about rations, about baking schedules, about the price of flour. That's how central bread was. It wasn't extra. It was the system. So, next time you see a pyramid or a statue of Ramses, remember the hands that shaped the loaves, that fed the workers, that offered to the gods. Those bakers may not be remembered by name, but their work built an empire. And here's the kicker. The techniques they used, the ovens, the mixing, the shaping, would be passed on to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the medieval world. Egypt set the table, and everyone else followed. In the next part of our story, bread goes west, across the sea, to marble columns, to the land of theater and olives, where bread becomes an art, and bakers become philosophers. We're heading to Greece. Let's keep walking. If Egypt was the land of sacred bread, Greece was the land of curious bread. The Greeks didn't just bake, they experimented, they asked questions. What if we added herbs? What if we used goat's milk instead of water? What if bread could be more beautiful? In ancient Greece, bread wasn't just fuel, it was art. The baker wasn't just a worker, he was an artisan, even a kind of philosopher. And Greece? Well, Greece loved a good debate, even about dough. Greek bakers made dozens of types of bread. They had honey loaves, cheese breads, anise-flavored buns, and something called artos, a soft, slightly sweet bread offered to the gods. They baked ring-shaped breads, leaf-shaped breads, even festival breads for special days. Some were steamed, some fried, some baked in round ovens made of clay and stone, and some were reserved only for ceremonies, because, once again, bread still had one foot in the spiritual world. Greek women often baked at home, but there were also professional bakers, and as cities like Athens grew, so did the demand for street food. Yup, ancient street food. Vendors sold hot bread from carts, warm, fragrant, wrapped in cloth. People would grab a loaf on the way to the market, or nibble bread while listening to a philosopher in the plaza. Food and ideas, always side by side. But the Greeks weren't alone for long, because across the sea, Rome was rising, and if there's one thing Rome knew how to do, it was scale things up. The Romans looked at Greek bread and said, "This is good. Now let's make 1,000,000 of them." And so Rome became the first civilization to mass-produce bread. They built enormous bakeries with rotating stone mills, grain elevators powered by donkeys, ovens big enough to hold dozens of loaves at a time. Some bakeries baked over 3,000 loaves per day. It was bread at scale. Roman bakers, called pastores, were part tradesmen, part engineer. They kneaded, fermented, shaped, scored, and stamped their loaves with official markings. Why? Because in Rome, bread was political. The government provided free or cheap bread to Roman citizens, especially in the city. It was part of the famous policy: bread and circuses. Feed the people, entertain them with games, and they'll stay quiet. It worked for a while. There were even grain doles, rations handed out regularly. Each citizen would line up, receive their share of flour or loaves, and return home. Bread kept the city moving. It wasn't optional, it was essential. And the bread itself? It varied. There were dark breads for the poor, wheat loaves for the middle class, and fine white breads, sometimes braided or stuffed, for the elite. Some breads were baked in pots, some were dusted with poppy seeds or herbs, others had dates, nuts, or cheeses inside. Rome didn't just copy Greece, it took the game further. But as the empire expanded, bread went with it. Roman soldiers carried hardtack, dry, tough biscuits that could last weeks. Settlers brought ovens and grain mills to every corner of the empire, from Britain to North Africa, from Gaul to Judea. Bread became Roman. In fact, if you walk through Pompeii, the city frozen in time by Mount Vesuvius, you can still see bakeries with intact ovens, even carbonized loaves of bread, stamped and shaped, just as they were left, nearly 2,000 years ago. That's how much bread was part of daily life. And yet, even with all this glory, all this expansion, something was starting to crumble. The empire. Trade routes began to collapse. Grain supplies dried up. And with the fall of Rome came the fall of big bread. The world was about to get a lot smaller and a lot hungrier. In the next part of our journey, we enter a darker chapter, where bread was no longer plentiful, but precious. Welcome to the early medieval world, where even crumbs mattered. The Roman Empire was gone, and with it went the roads, the big bakeries, the grain shipments from Egypt and Carthage, everything collapsed, and what was left behind? A Europe divided, rural, scattered, and hungry. Welcome to the Dark Ages. Now, the name Dark Ages might be a little unfair. There was still culture, art, and innovation in some places. But when it came to bread, things definitely got darker. Without the Roman grain system, communities had to grow their own grain, mill it by hand, bake it in home ovens or communal hearths. Everything was smaller. Everything was harder. The breads of the early medieval world were rough, dense, and often filled with whatever could be found. Barley, rye, millet, even peas, beans, and acorns ground into the mix. This wasn't for flavor, it was for survival. If the harvest failed, so did your bread. And if you didn't have grain, you made famine bread, a tragic blend of roots, bark, moss, and desperation, cooked over smoky fires in battered clay pots. It was chewy, it was bitter, but it kept you alive, barely. For most people, especially peasants, bread wasn't something you enjoyed. It was something you endured. You worked the fields all day, sowed the seeds, cut the grain with a sickle, threshed it, winnowed it, then ground it by hand. And maybe, just maybe, if nothing went wrong, you'd have a few coarse loaves to get you through the week. Most medieval homes didn't have proper ovens. They used open hearths, stone or clay platforms heated by fire. Bread was cooked on flat stones or inside pots buried in embers. Some villages had communal ovens owned by the local lord. But to use it, you had to pay. Not in coins necessarily, sometimes with eggs, or labor, or a piece of your dough. Yes, a bread tax. That's how feudalism worked. You didn't own the land, you didn't own the oven, you barely owned the grain you grew. Everything had a cost, even the right to bake. Now, not all breads were created equal. If you were rich, a noble, or a churchman, your bread looked very different. It was white, it was soft, it was sieved and sifted, sometimes multiple times. Wheat was expensive, and white bread took more effort, so of course it became a symbol of power. Meanwhile, the poor ate black bread made from rye or barley, coarse, chewy, sometimes sour. In fact, the darker your bread, the lower your status. Even bread had a hierarchy. But for all the hardship, there was something human that never went away. People still baked for each other. Villages held baking days. Families passed down recipes. Mothers taught daughters the feel of good dough, not by measuring, but by memory. Enough flour to make it soft, enough water to make it stick, enough time to make it rise. Bread was shared, broken, blessed. It was still more than food. It was life, and it was community. Even monasteries, those silent stone sanctuaries, baked bread daily. Monks grew their own wheat, ground it in water-powered mills, and baked loaves not just for themselves, but for the poor. It was charity, it was discipline, it was prayer, in dough. In this dark and difficult age, bread remained the thread, the connection between generations, between rich and poor, between heaven and earth. But change was coming, little by little. Towns would grow, markets would form, bread would move from the hearth to the shop, and new rules would shape who could bake what, and who could sell to whom. In the next chapter, we step into the medieval city, where bread isn't just survival anymore. It's trade, it's power, and it's business. As Europe slowly emerged from the shadows of the early Middle Ages, towns began to rise. Walls were built, markets were formed, people began to gather again, not just for survival, but for trade. And where there's trade, there's bread. Lots of it. Bread was no longer just a thing you made at home. It became a profession. Enter the baker. Flour on his apron, ash on his hands, always up before dawn. He was part craftsman, part merchant, and part magician. Because in a world without thermometers or timers, baking was an art. In the medieval town, you couldn't just decide to be a baker. You had to train. Usually, you'd start as an apprentice, a young boy sent to live with a master baker. You'd sweep floors, chop wood, scrub pans, and maybe, after a year or two, you'd be allowed to knead dough. Eventually, you'd become a journeyman. And if you were skilled and lucky, you could open your own shop, but only if the guild allowed it. Ah, yes, the guilds. Medieval cities were full of them. There were guilds for blacksmiths, for shoemakers, for weavers, and yes, for bakers. These were powerful organizations that controlled everything. Who could bake, what kind of bread they could sell, where they could set up shop, and how much they could charge. It was strict, it was organized, and it was enforced. Break the rules, you could be fined, shut down, even publicly shamed. Guilds also protected secrets. They passed down recipes, baking methods, oven-building techniques, from master to apprentice, generation to generation. A baker's knowledge was valuable and often kept in the family. But while bakers in cities were refining their craft, the bread itself wasn't always glamorous. Most folks still ate coarse, dark loaves. Grain quality depended on the harvest. Sometimes wheat was available, sometimes only rye or barley, and sometimes they stretched flour with ground beans, with peas, even with the dusty old bran swept off the floor. If you were poor, you took what you could get, but even among the poor, bread was a staple. It filled the belly. It gave strength, and it was everywhere. Breakfast, bread. Lunch, bread with cheese or onion. Dinner, bread with broth. Every meal, some bread. In the cities, bakeries lined the market streets, small shops with stone ovens, wood stacked outside, and the smell. Oh, the smell, drawing people in like a magnet. You could buy a warm loaf, or even pay to have your own dough baked. Some people made their dough at home, wrapped it in cloth, and walked it down to the baker to use his oven. For a fee, of course. Bread was also big business. In some cities, loaves were standardized. Officials would inspect bakeries, check weights, make sure no one was cheating customers. Too light, too small, too stale, you could be fined, or worse. In London, bakers who shorted customers were put in the pillory, locked into wooden stocks for all to see. A public lesson in honesty. Still, people loved bread. They fought over it. They celebrated with it. They even judged neighbors by it. Did you hear? Old Marta bakes with honey now. That family only eats white bread, must be doing well. That one, always buying day-old loaves, poor soul. Bread was food. Bread was gossip. Bread was life. But the deeper we go into the medieval world, the more bread becomes regulated by lords, by cities, by kings. Laws about size, laws about price, even laws about when you could bake. Because in the next part of our story, bread becomes political. It becomes taxed, restricted, and, at times, weaponized. It's no longer just about what you eat. It's about who's in charge, and whether or not you'll be allowed to have your daily loaf at all. By the high Middle Ages, Bread was no longer just something you ate. It was something you regulated, measured, controlled, and taxed. Because wherever there's value, you can bet someone's found a way to charge for it. Let's start with the most obvious law, the assize of bread, a fancy name for something very simple. It told bakers how much their bread had to weigh, what it could cost, and what ingredients were allowed. In England, the first assize was passed in 1266, and it stuck around for over 500 years. Why? Because people got angry when you messed with their bread. If a baker sold a light loaf, or raised prices during a famine, that could cause a riot. Literally, there are stories of townspeople storming bakeries, tearing down ovens, dragging bakers through the mud over bread. So the government stepped in. Bakers were weighed. Their loaves were inspected. Some towns had official bread scales right in the market square. Too light? You were fined. Or worse, pilloried in public. Not just a slap on the wrist, but locked into wooden stocks with your underweight loaf hanging around your neck. Humiliating and effective. To avoid punishment, bakers often gave a little extra with every sale. A bonus bun, a crusty heel, an extra roll tucked into the basket. This is where we get the term baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12. Better to be safe than shamed. But regulation didn't stop at weight. Oh no, there were rules about who could bake, when they could bake, even what kind of bread they were allowed to sell. Some towns divided bakers into classes. You had your white bread bakers, using fine flour baking for the rich, and your brown bread bakers, working with rye, barley, and bran, feeding the common folk. Each had their own guild, their own prices, their own corner of the marketplace. And yes, there were taxes. If you used the Lord's mill to grind your grain, you paid a fee. If you used the Lord's oven, you paid again. Sometimes in coin, sometimes in kind. A piece of your dough, a finished loaf, or a few days of labor during harvest season. Bread wasn't just food, it was currency. Now enter the church, because where there's daily bread, there's spiritual bread too. The church played a massive role in medieval life, and that included your oven. Baking bread for holy days? There were rules. Using fine wheat during Lent? That could be frowned upon. Every village had feast days, saints' days, fast days. And often, bread had to reflect those moments. Simple on Fridays, fancier on Easter. Round loaves for the harvest, braided loaves for weddings. It was all part of the rhythm of life. Monasteries had their own bakeries and their own rules. Some baked twice a day, others only once a week, but most had a schedule that revolved around prayer, silence, and the smell of bread rising. The monks weren't just praying, they were feeding the poor, feeding pilgrims, feeding each other. And what about the sacred loaf, the host, the wafer used in communion? It had to be unleavened, pure, baked under strict conditions, usually by priests or nuns, because in the moment of Mass, that bread became more than food. It became holy. So bread wasn't just taxed, or weighed, or baked. It was watched by the Bakers' Guild, by the town officials, by the king, and by God himself. It was at the center of life, on your table, in your prayers, in your taxes, and in your punishment. A loaf could bless you, feed you, fool you, or ruin you. But it wasn't done evolving yet. In the next part of our story, we look at how bread took on new shapes, not just in the oven, but in the mind. It became ritual, It became a symbol. It became sacred in ways far beyond food. Let's keep going. By now, it's clear. Bread wasn't just something you ate. It was something you believed in. In medieval Europe, bread touched every part of life, from the humblest hut to the grandest cathedral. And for many, it wasn't just food, it was a blessing. Let's start with the most sacred loaf of all, the host. In Christian tradition, especially in Catholic Europe, the small round wafer used in communion wasn't just a symbol. It was, quite literally, considered the body of Christ. When a priest raised it during Mass, when the bell rang, when the faithful bowed their heads, that bread became holy. And because of that, it had to be treated with great care. It was baked without yeast, made only from the purest wheat flour, and often prepared by monks or nuns under strict silence and prayer. Some monasteries had entire rooms devoted to baking the host, with stone tables, simple tools, and sunlight filtering through stained glass, a sacred space for a sacred task. But sacred bread wasn't limited to churches. Even in homes, bread was part of ritual. At births, a special loaf might be baked for the midwife. At weddings, bread was broken and shared between families. At funerals, loaves were given to mourners as a sign of comfort and continuity. Bread marked beginnings and endings. During holidays and feast days, families made decorated loaves, braided for fertility, round for the sun, stamped with crosses or symbols for protection. Some loaves were even made in the shape of animals, to bring luck or scare away evil spirits. People believed bread could do more than fill the stomach. It could guard the soul. In harvest festivals, the first loaf from the new wheat was given as an offering, sometimes to the church, sometimes to the land itself, broken, shared, and thanked for. Because without the harvest, there was no bread, and without bread, there was no life. People hung bread over doorways, placed crumbs in the walls of new houses, or tossed pieces into rivers to bless the water. These weren't just superstitions. They were signs of respect, of fear, of reverence. Bread was alive in the imagination. And in harder times, when famine struck, when plagues came, when war stole the fields and fire burned the mills, bread took on a different role. It became a test of faith, of patience, of community. Churches would hand out charity loaves, often called alms bread. Wealthier families might distribute bread to the poor during Lent or Advent. In some towns, the baker was required by law to give a portion of bread to the needy, a kind of holy tax. Because when your neighbor was starving, a crust of bread could be the difference between life and death. Even language carried the symbolism. The word companion comes from Latin cum panis, meaning with bread. A companion was someone you shared a loaf with, and the word Lord, in Old English, hlafwerd. It meant bread keeper. That's how serious bread was. It defined relationships, power, piety, and in moments of deep fear or deep hope, people turned to bread. If someone was sick, a priest might bless a loaf and place it near their bed. If a child was restless, a crust placed under the pillow might bring calm. If the fields were dry, a piece of bread might be buried at the edge of the farm, as a silent prayer for rain. Bread was more than nourishment. It was meaning, memory, and magic. And as the medieval world moved forward, through plagues and wars and reformations, bread never lost that weight. Even today, when we break bread at a table, when we say grace, when we bake for others. We echo those ancient hands and those sacred hopes. In the final part of our story, we'll leave the old world behind and look ahead, because the journey of bread isn't over. It still sits at our tables, still connects our stories, and still rises every day. So here we are, at the end of a journey that started with wild grass and ended with golden loaves in cathedral cities. We've walked through deserts and temples, past Greek ovens and Roman bakeries, through medieval fields, monasteries, markets, and guilds. And all along the way, bread has been there, not just as food, but as a mirror, a reflection of the world that made it. In ancient times, bread meant survival. It was coarse, hard, elemental, a mixture of grain, water, fire, and faith. It was the first real tool humans had to store energy, to feed a village, to build a future. It turned hunters into farmers, and wanderers into neighbors. It gave rise to cities, and then empires. In Egypt, bread became sacred, offered to gods, paid to workers, inspected by pharaohs. In Greece, bread became creative, spiced, shaped, steamed, fried, celebrated, and sold on the streets. In Rome, bread became public, mass-produced, government-managed, a political tool for peace and control. And in medieval Europe, bread became everything. It was the fuel of the poor, the pride of the rich, the concern of kings, and the comfort of the church. It was taxed, it was blessed, it was feared, and it was fought over. And now it's just bread, a thing we buy in plastic bags, slice with machines, throw away when it's stale. But is that all? Or is there something still hiding in that crust? Let's take a moment to think about the loaf on your table, that sandwich you ate last week, that dinner roll at your grandmother's house, that smell of fresh baking on a rainy afternoon. That's history. Real, ancient, sacred, sweaty, beautiful history. Right there in your hands. Because bread never left us. We just forgot to look at it closely. Every time someone kneads dough, every time flour dust rises in the air, every time a child waits by the oven, a bit of that long, winding history comes back. Bread today has taken many forms. We have croissants, and naan, and bagels, and brioche. We have sourdough baked in cast iron, and flatbread toasted on griddles. We have bakeries run by fifth-generation families, and others powered by AI and conveyor belts. And still, the core hasn't changed. Flour, water, time, and heat. The same magic that started it all still feeds us. And there's something beautiful about that. In a world that moves too fast, where everything is touch screens and data, bread reminds us to slow down, to smell, to wait, to break, to share. When we bake bread, we take part in a ritual older than writing. When we eat bread, we join the billions who came before us, from the first woman grinding grain on a stone, to the monk praying over a rising loaf, to the mother pulling bread from a hearth on a cold morning. We join them, in silence, in gratitude, and in wonder. So maybe bread isn't just something you eat. Maybe it's something you carry, in your memories, in your family, in your body, and in your story. And the next time you hold a slice, or smell a crust, or hear the crackle of a fresh loaf cooling on a wire rack, you'll remember, you'll know, that this simple, quiet, warm thing has shaped more than just meals. It has shaped civilizations, from sand to stone, from feast to famine, from gods to groceries. This is the story of bread, our oldest companion, our daily miracle. our living legacy. So, go ahead, break a piece, take a bite, close your eyes, and remember, you're tasting history.